So when I came out 40 years ago, there were really not a lot of terms that defined people who identified or who were off the gender norm. You really were either gay or lesbian. There wasn't a lot of in between. It was pretty simple. Several years later, they added in an effort to be more inclusive of everyone who is non-cisgender or non-binary. They added bi and trans to the equation. So people of our community started being identified as LGBT and T. So as I said, it was really an effort to be more inclusive of everybody that up until then had really been called the gay community. But despite their intent, the letters really, as people started expressing themselves differently through their gender and their attractions, those letters proved to continue to be limiting. And as times and attitudes have changed, the language used to discuss sexual orientation and gender identity has also changed. So as a result, the established LGBT abbreviation has acquired quite a few more letters. We now, for the most part, utilize LGBTQIA as to identify this this community. And so I thought that this would be a really good place to start to really talk through what some of these gender identities are and sexual orientations. And when you look at the ABCs or the LGBTQIA, not every one of those letters means the same thing to everyone. A couple of those letters mean different things to different people. So when you look at the letter Q, that has been as we entered the 21st century, the letter Q for many people stood for questioning, but for many others, the letter Q stands for the word queer, which is a catch-all term that back in the 50s and the 60s was really a derogatory term. And it has really shed those origins and is gaining acceptance as one of those kind of all-encompassing words for the population. And then there's the letter A. A lot of people think that a lot of people say that A stands for ally, which a lot of you would be. An ally is a supporter is typically a cisgender supporter of the LGBTQIA population. But many other people look at the letter A and say that and think that it stands for asexual, which is something that we'll get into here in a couple of minutes. So and then at the very end is a plus sign, which is meant to cover anyone else who's not included in or doesn't identify in one of these 7 letters. One of the things to keep in mind is This list is very fluid and ever-changing, and it is by no means an all-inclusive list of our vocabulary. But as we'll start with these, and I think it's important to start with the basics, which would be gay and lesbian. Gay and lesbian are really as basic as it gets. As the word homosexual began to feel to a lot of people very clinical and pejorative, gay became the de rigueur kind of mainstream term to refer to same-sex attraction in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Gradually, as what was then called the gay liberation movement gained steam, the phrase gay and lesbian became more popular as a way to highlight the similar yet separate issues that were faced by women in the fight for tolerance. Gay is still sometimes used as an umbrella term, but these days it really refers more to specifically to men, as in the gays and the lesbians. The next term on the list is bisexual, and it is defined as someone who is attracted to people of their own gender or other gender identities. It is not it's not a way station from going from straight to gay, as it had once been described. The stereotypes around bisexuality, for instance, that it's a transitional stage or a cover-up for promiscuity, have been at the center of conversation within the LGBTQ community for years and years. And there has been a really persistent questioning or a negation of bisexual identity, that, you know, is this really something that people experience or that they identify that way? But the term is becoming much more resurgent. But some people all argue that the prefix bi reinforces a male-female gender binary that isn't inclusive enough. The next term on the list is pansexual, and this is someone who is attracted to people of all gender identities, or someone who is attracted to a person's qualities regardless of their gender identity. The prefix pan means all, and it really sort of rejects the gender binary that some people argue is implied by the term bisexual. It was really, up until recently, it was a very niche term. It was used by academics, but it's really entered the mainstream. People like Miley Cyrus and Janelle Monáe have both come out and identified themselves as pansexual. Asexual, or ace, is someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. You don't want to confuse them with people who identify as aromantic, who are people who experience little or no romantic attraction. Asexual people do not always identify as aromantic. Aromantic people do not always identify as asexual. You can be sexually attracted to someone without having romance. And you can have romance with someone without being sexually attracted to them. So, so that's how those two terms work together and against one another. A demisexual is someone who generally doesn't experience sexual attraction unless they have formed a strong emotional, but not necessarily romantic connection with someone. And a sapiosexual is someone who finds intelligence sexually attractive or arousing. Gray sexual is someone who occasionally experiences sexual attraction, but usually does not. It covers kind of a gray space between asexuality and sexual identity. Next on the list is cisgender, and this is someone whose gender identity exactly matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. And I think that this probably, while you can be bisexual, you can also be cisgender. Cisgender is most people fall under the term cisgender. Transgender, on the other hand, is a wide-ranging term for people whose gender identity or gender expression differs from the biological sex that they were assigned at birth. One thing that I always point out when we talk about transgender, transgendered is not a word. People often use it, but someone is not a transgendered person. They are transgender. Trans and trans plus are two umbrella terms for non-cisgendered people with non-cisgendered identities. Next is gender non-conforming, or GNC. This is somebody who expresses gender outside of the traditional norms associated with masculinity and femininity. Not all gender non-conforming people are transgender, and some transgender people express gender in conventionally masculine or feminine ways. Non-binary is a person who identifies as neither male or female and sees themselves outside the gender binary. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as NB or ENBY, NB. If you've ever seen the show, the series, I believe it's either on Showtime or HBO, called Billions. There is a character on that show who it was really they were the first non-binary character on television. And the role is played by a non-binary actor whose name is Asia Kate Dillon. And one of the things that is often talked about with people who identify as non-binary is that you can't necessarily look at them and say that person is male or that person is female. They share a lot of traits between the two, and actually have a lot of none of the traits. Next is genderqueer, which is also a term that's used to describe someone whose gender identity is outside the strict male and female binary. They may exhibit both traditionally masculine and feminine qualities, or they may display neither. Gender fluid is a term that is used by people whose identity shifts or fluctuates. Sometimes these individuals may identify or express themselves as more masculine on some days and more feminine on others. You may be familiar with people like Billy Porter, a famous actor now, who you will often see on the red carpet wearing a beautiful gown and heels. He got his start in acting playing the transgender role in Kinky Boots. Billy Porter is a perfect example of someone who is gender fluid. Next is gender neutral, someone who prefers not to be described as a specific gender, but prefers they as a singular pronoun, as opposed to he or she. The honorific MX dot, which is a substitute for the Mr. or Ms., is something that a lot of gender neutral folks utilize. Next are MAAB, FAAB, and UAAB, which are stand for male assigned at birth, female assigned at birth, and unassigned at birth. So these would be how you were identified through your gender at birth. That doesn't mean that as an adult or as in later in your life that you still identify that way.
Hey, Blaine.
Yeah.
I'd like to just stop you for a second because this is a little overwhelming. But gender neutral, is that the only, when you identify that way, that's the only time you use the pronouns them and their,
No.
or they?
No, a lot of people use they, them, their, as opposed to he, she, he, him, his, or she, hers.
So a lot of people prefer that.
Right.
And
Yes.
can identify a lot of different ways.
Yeah, Scott, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. So that's a really great question. I think that like pronoun usage, or like the way that we talk about a person, is sometimes really closely linked to our gender identity. And I think in the main culture at large, it definitely has historically been. However, there are folks within the LGBTQ community who maybe identify even as female, but would prefer to use male pronouns. So it can get kind of interesting, and pronoun usage is really dependent on the person and their own preferences. And is usually just a conversation with someone about like, how do you like to be, if people are talking about you, how do you like to be talked about? So lots of folks who are, for example, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid may like to use they, them pronouns, or they may not so much. They may be more comfortable with she or he or something completely different.
My learning curve is very up on this. It's hard to use they, them, their, and we have a friend that prefers that. Actually, they is a friend of our children, and they prefer that. And I knew this person growing up, so to change to they, them has been a real steep learning curve for me. So, and they is never unhappy or angry or anything when I mess up, but it is a whole new way for many of us to be thinking, and it would be helpful, I think, if we could practice it somehow, or be around it more. Maybe I don't know. It's there. I'd like there to be a way I could teach myself to be better at it.
You know, I talked to my mom about this, and we were talking about this, and I said, think of it like when you were young and you were going to go hang out with a friend, but you didn't want your mom to know it was a boy, but you also didn't want to lie. So you said, I'm going to go hang out with them, and their house is over there, and they are in the math club. Or that, I think that was helpful for her. Or think about maybe someone left something behind, but like left a wallet on the bus, and you don't necessarily know who that person is, and you don't want to, you wouldn't know, but they left that wallet behind. I think there's lots of maybe examples of ways that we already kind of use this in our language that kind of can help it to translate over. But you're right, it does take some practice. And with pronouns especially, I think that what's really important, if you're really wanting to get pronouns right and just be really affirming for folks and have folks really feeling like you care, is to understand that we're always going to make mistakes. We're human beings. And I think non-binary folks or folks who use they, them definitely understand that. When I train our staff, something that we talk about is it's not a process of never trying to make a mistake, but it is a process of when we make a mistake, just being okay to say, oh, sorry, I meant them, and then just moving right along. Because sometimes what we can do instead is say things like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, I really didn't mean to get that wrong. And that can kind of make it even more awkward sometimes. So we even at work sometimes will say, if someone corrects us on a pronoun, we'll either say sorry and use the right one and move on, or sometimes we'll even say, oh, thank you. Like, you're right. They were going to go to the store. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And Beth, you may have noticed if you're involved in many meetings or anything like that, or at least in Scout and I's world, many meetings are started with introductions, and part of the introductions are identifying your preferred pronouns. For instance, my name is Blaine Proctor. I'm the CEO at Save Inc., and my preferred pronouns are he, him, his. Many meetings that I attend these days are started out by everybody identifying their pronouns. It doesn't hurt to ask. I've never had anybody be offended by me asking what their preferred pronouns were.
Blaine, I couldn't hear your third pronoun. It was he, him, what?
He, him, his.
His. Oh, yeah. My computer wasn't clear. Just in keeping with that, I used the word transgendered when I was speaking informally before the meeting, and I knew immediately that was wrong, and I changed it. But it would have been good to say, "Excuse me," or "I'm sorry," and go on. Yeah, thank you.
Blaine, it's Dallas.
Huh?
Are you there? Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes.
I missed your definition of queer.
Queer is really just all encompassing. I mean, it's a word that back like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even when I came out in the early 80s, was not necessarily considered a nice term, nice thing to call someone. Since I would say in the last 20 years, it's probably been much more accepted as sort of a more of an umbrella term for anybody who identifies outside of what is considered the norm.
Okay. I have one other question. After you talked about the aromantic, you used two terms and defined them, and I did not get those two terms. One was race sexual or something like that.
Asexual.
No, I had that. It was after that.
It was
Gray
gray.
sexual. Yeah, gray sexual.
Gray.
Oh, gray.
Oh, gray sexual.
Okay. And there's one other one just before that.
Sapiosexual.
Sapio.
Yeah, I didn't get that.
Yeah,
Say that again.
someone who is sapiosexual is someone who finds intelligence sexually attractive or arousing.
Boy.
I think what's really fun about the word queer is that it is kind of an umbrella term. It does have that that history behind it, that a lot of people have experienced trauma, maybe because of growing up in school or being called that, or how that's associated with. So this is kind of still a debate among, especially like intergenerationally, kind of still a debate. And a lot of younger people really feel okay with that word. So it kind of depends who you're talking to. But in terms of reclamation, oh, and I see that we put it in the chat here. So yeah, so the intention there is to reclaim a word that has been used to like cause harm or cause trauma to the community. And when we talk about this in the community, sometimes people will say like, if I take my enemy's sword, it's now my sword. So that the word has been, yeah, reclaimed, and the community kind of has ownership of that now.
For us older people, it's almost like the N word.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
there's still a lot of people who still really feel that way, especially having grown up. I grew up with Smear the Queer was a game at my high school and was something that was talked about. And so yeah, I think a lot of folks still kind of have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree wholeheartedly, Dallas. I remember being called queer and it was not a compliment.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Um, so
I have trouble using the word. I grew up in a jock culture, and you know, it's
yeah, it's only been, it's really, for me, it's only been the last year or so that I've been able to use it comfortably.
mhm.
So I'll just go through these last two. Intersex is a term for somebody who was born with biological sex characteristics that aren't traditionally associated with a male or a female body. Intersexuality does not refer to sexual orientation or to gender identity. This is, for instance, someone who uh, for something that a word that people may or may not be familiar with is hermaphrodite, which is a person who is born with the genitalia of both male and female. That is the most extreme form of intersexuality. There are a lot of other forms of intersexuality that people may experience, but once again, it doesn't refer to sexual orientation or gender identity. And then the last thing there on the list is just plus. The plus sign is no longer just a mathematical symbol, but it's a denotation of everything on the gender and the sexuality spectrum that these 7 letters don't capture and don't describe.
I was just going to add, Blaine, intersexuality, I think that folks probably think that, if you had to guess, how common would you think that that is?
Not very common.
Yeah. So as Blaine described, it can be like physical abnormalities or sexual development that's not typical of male or female. It can also be a genetic variation. So normally people are born with an XX or XY chromosomes. Some people actually can have a 3rd chromosome or can have an XO chromosome, and that can show up in different ways in terms of their development. So in a study in the UK, for example, I'm going to answer the question I asked. 1 in 60 people is intersex. And of the people that they identified that either had ambiguous genitalia or a chromosomal marker for being intersex, 97% of those people had no idea whatsoever that they were even intersex. So it is a little bit more, I mean, I imagine if you grew up or if you spent your career working in an office or something, you were probably around about 60 people. And it's very, very likely that many people are not even aware that they have these genetic markers. It often doesn't come out sometimes until people try to conceive kids, and then they have trouble, and so they do some testing and then find out this about themselves. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Scott. So any other questions on the ABCs?
Just one more, that the I always means intersex in the LGBTQIA.
For the most part, yeah. I mean, like I said at the beginning, these identifications and everything change on a daily basis. I mean, it's almost hard to keep up with them. But yeah, when you're looking at LGBTQIA, I is typically going to stand for intersex.
Okay.
You know, one of the things that strikes me about this with interest is, you know, when you teach in a, I suppose it'd be true for younger people, but I've never done that. But when you teach adults, you know, in a university or graduate school setting, one of the things that you want to be very much aware of is transference. You know, when somebody will think they're in love with you when really, you know, they aren't. But it occurs to me that that when you're talking about gray sexual, you could be using the term of transference to cover some experience that is more like gray sexuality than like transference. Would that be, is that thinkable in terms of the kind of research you see? Do you understand what have I been clear about my comment? You know, as a professor, you always have to be very careful about students that fall in love with you. And I mean, they do it with anybody. I mean, even me. And so you need to be very careful about that. And I'm just trying to say that maybe some of that sometimes was misidentified as transference, and it should have been seen perhaps as gray sexual.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it certainly makes sense.
Just
well, would they not
thinking
be
out loud.
Would they not be Sapio,
you mean?
Sapio?
Sort of the difference between Sapio and
I'm
gray
sorry,
sexual.
I meant Sapio. I
okay.
down on my list. I meant Sapio. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Apologize.
That's okay.
Well, and I would think there are people that don't identify themselves. They aren't going to say I'm sapiosexual or gray sexual or asexual. You know, they're just, you know, and I don't know how important that is, you know.
I would just like to say I'm a retired high school counselor, and I would love to have had some of this as I was working with my students. I've kept in contact with them as they're young adults now and even getting married, and a number of them are, I have one transgender student, former student, who I'm now in contact with, and I just really feel that I could have helped so much more if I had no information as a high school student in a Kansas City, Missouri charter school. And so thank you so much, because I feel that I'm getting to some information that will help me going forward in my relationships.
Sure. And a lot of what you're talking about, not being able to relate or identify to what these kids are going through or how they are identifying is what results in youth homelessness, and that's what we're that's what we're going to talk about next.
I have one other question.
Okay.
Do you see in the future, if which is a big if, there's not a lot of stigma related to any one of these, that people will just become sexual?
Oh
No.
gosh. That's a big question.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that would be the most wonderful thing. It's just,
Yeah.
I'm sexual.
That's way outside my wheelhouse.
Yeah. Okay.
Good question though, Dallas. All right, any other questions about any of this? All
Yeah,
right.
Blaine, this is Karen Mitchell, and I just wondered if there was violence associated more with some of these categories more so than others. Well, just go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I don't know of any research around that. I think that we all are aware of the extreme violence that the transgender community experiences.
Mhm.
In fact, I would say that the trans community is probably experiencing a lot of the violence that, like back in my day, and prior to that, or back when I was young, and prior to that, young gay men were experiencing. I just know how horrible it is for the trans community. Scout, do you have any figures around any of that?
I don't off the top of my head. You're spot on though. There's you know, and right now, I hate to get political, but right now there are these bills coming out, you know, in Florida about not even allowing young people to really talk about their identities in a school setting where they can kind of feel safe, and that the propensity for really negative mental health outcomes because of policy like that is just really dangerous. And that's outside it. That's obviously like violence toward oneself, but I think that violence toward yourself so counts. You know, like in like the 2010s, I think there was the It Gets Better movement, and that was about young people who are LGBTQ were committing suicide at alarming rates because of mostly online bullying. And the internet is just there was a study recently that said they surveyed the internet, and 60% of what was on the internet was negative feedback. And so I think young people especially are really at high risk for not only violence from the outside world, and obviously the trans community is really at high risk for violence, but also violence towards the self. And it's pretty concerning, the legislation that we're seeing being proposed, and the impact that that's going to have on young people and their mental health.
Thanks, Scout. So when we start looking at youth homelessness, especially LGBTQIA youth homelessness, what we're going to go through now through a lot of the rest of the slides is a lot of data, and then at the end we'll look at more kind of what it looks like locally here in Kansas City. A lot of this data is national in scope, because there just isn't a lot of it out there. So as we were researching prior to Pride Haven opening up, doing a lot of research and things like that, that's where a lot of this comes from. And I have my sources listed at the end that you'll see. But every year, there's an estimated 4.2 million youth and young adults who experience homelessness, of which about 700,000 of them are unaccompanied minors, which means that they are not part of a family or accompanied by a parent or a guardian. On any given night, approximately 41,000 unaccompanied youth between the ages of 13 and 25 experience homelessness. Data shows that once a youth is on the streets, as this slide shows, for 48 hours, the likelihood of them becoming a victim of a crime or falling into the homeless system reaches 80%. And when we're talking about when we're talking about crime, we're talking about trafficking, we're talking about rape, we're talking about assault, things like that. So there's a very short window that we have to help these kids before something really horrible can happen to them.
Blaine, will you give us a copy of this at the end of this so we can have these data?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. 1 in 10 young adults between the ages of 18 and 25 experience some form of unaccompanied homelessness over the course of a year. So when you look at this age group, this group that are of the age where they can be aging out of foster care, 10% of them are going to experience homelessness, unaccompanied homelessness over a year. It's estimated that 7% of the youth in the United States identify as LGBTQIA. But at the same time, 40% of the homeless youth population identify that way. And it's proven that LGBTQIA youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their non. I'm going to start using the word queer because it's easier than using all of those letters, than their non-queer peers. The homeless youth population has very unique needs. Young people who have the combined burden of homelessness and the challenges of identifying as queer have even more extreme needs and experiences than their non-LGBTQIA peers. Many factors increase a person's odds of experiencing homelessness. Demographic risk factors for becoming homeless include being Hispanic or Black, parenting and unmarried or LGBTQ, with LGBTQ youth having more than twice the risk of being homelessness than their cisgender and their heterosexual peers. In a March 2019 report, the Congressional Research Service identified family conflict and family dynamics, youth sexual orientation and sexual activity, school problems, pregnancy, and substance abuse as primary risk factors for youth homelessness. Youth who identify as both LGBTQIA and Black or multiracial have some of the highest rates of homelessness. In New York City, more than 1 out of 3 homeless youth between the ages of 13 and 20 identify as LGBTQIA, and those youth are more frequently young people of color. There are clear documented links between queer youth and the increased likelihood of depression, anxiety, and overall psychological distress. According to a local survey, less than 40% of queer youth reported always feeling safe at school, and 11% reported never feeling safe while they were at school. The American Academy of Pediatrics finds youth experience homelessness are twice as likely to attempt suicide as their peers who are not homeless.
You know, I was talking earlier about suicide among gay youth, and the number one factor for suicide prevention that studies have identified is just knowing one affirming and safe adult. So I think that's pretty powerful and impactful, and I think it speaks to the importance of you all being here today and learning about some of this stuff.
So 29% of homeless youth report having substance abuse problems. 69% of homeless youth report mental health problems. And I think that that's something that Scout can speak to when we're talking about the kids that we're serving at Pride Haven. And 30% of LGBTQ youth report at least one suicide attempt within the last year, and nearly 50% of transgender youth have seriously thought about suicide. Human development also plays a role. Rational decision-making, inhibition, planning, and reasoning are all stifled until young people mature, making them biologically more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors such as unsafe sexual activity and substance abuse, or substance use, I should say. Without safe and permanent homes and caring adults, runaway and homeless youth are at even greater risk of engaging in high-risk behaviors or putting themselves in unsafe or risky situations. Obviously, youth who are homeless, often experience a significant disruption in their education due to the transient nature of homelessness. Another thing that is discussed a lot when it comes to youth homelessness is the foster care system. 33% of these kids who experience youth homelessness had once been part of the foster care system. Youth in foster care face many factors that increase their risk of homelessness, including the number of foster care placements, a history or running away from placements, and time spent in a group home. While some youth are placed into foster care because of abuse, neglect, or poverty, many LGBTQ youth enter the system after their families have rejected them and thrown them out of their homes. 24% of the young people in foster care identify as LGBTQ.
In Missouri, they've actually changed. So it used to be if a youth was denied access to their home and they were under 18, that automatically had to be hotlined. And what was happening is there was a lot of youth that were not welcome to their home, and then they would go and they would seek homeless services, and they would have to be hotlined, and that would actually make them unsafe because they would then have to go back to families that were not accepting. Like the state would say, no, you have to go back here. So the law in Missouri has actually been changed so that if you're 16 or older and you don't want the hotline call to be made, it doesn't have to be made. So that's in an attempt to help people kind of make their own decisions.
A lot of the young people who identify as LGBTQ and are experiencing homelessness are more likely to report experiencing negative interactions with police and other frontline workers. 50% of the homeless youth have been in the juvenile system or in jail or detention. The consequences of that are faced by youth experiencing homelessness are vast. Runaway and homeless youth are vulnerable to multiple threats, many threats, including not having their basic food and shelter needs met, untreated mental health disorders, substance abuse, sexually transmitted diseases and HIV infection, sexual exploitation, including survival sex to meet basic needs, physical victimization, and suicide. We here at Save Inc., we participated in a demonstration project with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Justice. We were one of 8 sites in the United States chosen to participate in this, and it was to look at the intersectionality of HIV, homelessness, and intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And in the conversations that I had, I'd never thought of this. In the conversations that I had with people who know a lot more about intimate personal violence than I do, I always thought that if I agreed to have sex with someone tonight so that I could have a place to sleep, that was basically consensual. That was me agreeing to have sex with someone so that I could have a place to sleep. But it's exactly the opposite. When someone gives up the rights to their body in order to have a place to sleep tonight, that is considered intimate partner violence. You have just given up the rights to your body to have a safe place to lay your head. And it was literally mind-blowing for me when it was pointed out. Here on this slide, it shows 27% of LGBTQ youth who are homeless reported exchanging sex for basic needs, compared to 9% of non-queer youth who reported the same thing. And 62% of queer youth reported being physically harmed while experiencing homelessness, while 47% of non-queer youth report the same thing. So the risk to this population is intense at any given time. So next we'll look at Kansas City, because like I said, a lot of the data that I've been throwing at you is national data. Here's what it looks like here in Kansas City. Every year, the local continuum of care does what they call a point in time count. And that's where one night in January, often it's the coldest night of the year, volunteers go out and count the number of people on the streets, in shelters, in camps, who are homeless, who are unsheltered that night, sheltered or unsheltered. They didn't do one this year because of Omicron. But in 2019, the Kansas City Point in Time count asked homeless youth how they identified it. It was the first time that they'd ever done it. 15.6% of the respondents identified as LGBTQIA. 13.8% provided no answer. And the COC, the Continuum of Care, put out this quote that says the extrapolation of this data might suggest a larger LGBTQ population that was uncomfortable or in an unsafe space to truly identify themselves, though the data doesn't necessarily speak to that possibility. Even though if potentially up to 1/5 or 20% of the total homeless population in Kansas City does in fact identify as LGBTQIA. New housing options in the area should promote safety, freedom of expression, and trauma-informed care. The Kansas City Anti-Violence Project, or KCAVP, estimates that the true number of homeless youth identifying as LGBTQIA is probably closer to 50%. And there are and are more likely to experience discrimination, violence, and a lack of support while experiencing homelessness than their straight peers are. The average length of homelessness for an unaccompanied youth in Kansas City is almost 11 months. That's a long time to be on the streets by yourself. 14% of the youth experience chronic homelessness. 35% of the youth have a disabling condition. And the J. Walter Thompson Innovation Group said that more youth are openly exploring gender and sexual orientation. Only 48% of youth between the ages of 13 and 20 identify as exclusively heterosexual. If Kansas City follows this trend, there are potentially over 300,000 youth in our area that will not identify as exclusively heterosexual, and it will experience a time of exploring LGBTQ plus lifestyles, creating a larger population of young people potentially in danger of homelessness due to rejection by family and friends. Any questions?
Oh, a million.
Any
I
comments?
don't know how long you're planning on going, but I am thinking, what can we do to help?
I'm going to go back here. It's really where was the third bullet point there? Promoting safety, freedom of expression, and trauma-informed care. Everything that Scout does at Pride Haven, in fact, everything that we do here at Save Inc. Is based in trauma-informed care. We have gone, we've gone beyond actually doing trauma-informed care, and I talked to our property managers about doing trauma-informed property management, so that we are really, looking at where these people are coming from, what their experiences have been, and meeting them where they're at, to the best of our abilities. Scout, you want to jump in here with anything?
I don't know. It's such a top. Is there something you want me to talk about specifically? I think that what a lot of LGBTQ young people have experienced in their lifetimes and in their communities and in other shelters is religious trauma or religious persecution. And there are many religious-based shelters in the community, and they do provide services to so many people in the community, and those services work really great for those people. What is tough is in those settings, a lot of the times LGBTQ young people don't necessarily have their identities respected. So for example, if they need underwear and they go to ask for underwear, we all, I'm sure, have our own preferences about what kind of underwear we wear. And in these settings, they will say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you the kind of underwear that you want to wear. You're going to get these. And it really just is an experience that, like, for something that touches your body very intimately and something that can be so closely linked to identity, is just a small example of how spaces can really intend to do good and provide people a place off the street, but really be doing some harm and some damage to folks. And so we have we have worked really hard to try to just be as affirming as we possibly can, and to provide people options, and to provide our staff with education about how to meet the needs of these young people. I feel like that was completely off the rails, but I just, in reading that and considering how many service providers there are in the community who are doing this work, and it is challenge, and you do look at it and you're like, wow, what do we do? How do we fix this? It's a complicated problem, and nobody's figured it out yet in the last 3,000 years or however many. So I think that Save Inc. is great because they kind of tackle the problem from multiple angles. Save Inc. provides, for people who are already housed, they provide utility and mortgage payment assistance to try to keep people from disrupting their housing. And then we do this to try to get people into housing, and then also just providing affordable and safe and dignified housing options. Save Inc. is kind of just attacking the problem from all angles.
Scott, can I ask you? So, as far as Trinity goes, our goal is to be more visible. And so, my question is, how do we cross that barrier now that's up because people have been persecuted from a religious standpoint, to let people know that we're here, we're not judgmental, we're open and accepting of you as who you are, and to come in to Trinity to participate at whatever level that you want to. And also then to support needs. I guess the other thing that we're looking at is how can we help and know that there's not an expectation or an obligation that you're attending church. Right? So there's two things there. How do we let people know that we're not that condemning church, and that we're here and you get to come as you are, right? And you get to participate. We want you in our home.
I think people, I mean, the proof is right behind you. I think people know that you're an affirming and open religious space. So I think that you all have focused on communicating that to the community. I think that as with any trauma, having religious trauma, I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. I'll just do some self-disclosure. I grew up in the Kingdom Hall, and so very strict, very disciplined, very different set of rules and expectations. And so as with any trauma, right, it takes time, and it takes work, and it takes relationships and healing to try to overcome those pains from the past. So I think, yeah, I know that we had talked a little bit about maybe trying to find some volunteer opportunities for folks to be able to help. And I don't know if everyone in this group knows, but we've been getting delicious and beautiful meals every Monday for, I don't know, it feels like forever now. And we so appreciate that. And we're kind of constantly reevaluating with COVID what opportunities we can provide, and what things are good fits, and what things do you want to be doing as a community.
Scout, one of the things that we have coming up on March 6th, which is a Sunday, we're planning to have a pizza lunch, and we're planning, I think we might have mentioned it to you, but we're sending an invitation, of flyer to invite people, staff and your guests. All of a sudden, it's occurring to me that coming to Trinity on a Sunday for the very first time might be difficult, but coming on a different day might be more acceptable. Is that something that you're saying to us? Am I getting that? Not.
No, I don't think so. I don't
Okay.
think so. So we'll talk more about next time about how our program works. But one of the things that we have talked about is that it is very difficult for the young people to find spaces to hang out on Sundays. And some of our young people are religious. They're like, yep, religious trauma, I have it, but I still have my faith, and this is where I am, and I'm a queer person, and I'm okay with that. So I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone's experience, but I think that Sunday is a time that is really hard to find somewhere to go and hang out. And so I think that I am hopeful that I think people will be interested in going on Sunday, because especially if it's cold out, I think that they will want a place to be. We put a sign up in the house, and we're just kind of like reminding people as we're seeing them. And I'm going to try to get together a little caravan of cars or staff members who would be able to take people to and from, but it's not super far. So if they're,
No,
I
it's
mean,
really
if there's
close.
pizza, they'll probably figure out how to get there. So yeah, no, I think they're excited about it. I'm excited to come.
Great.
I have a question that I brought up before, but it was pointed out to me how some of us are not aware of, I don't know if you call it microaggressions, but just our words that we use. And one was inclusive, that word says we want you to be a part of us. And instead of a collegial or kind of relationship that's not we and you. Just a comment.
I like inclusive.
Okay.
At Save Inc., we have our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging task force. I'm personally a fan of inclusive. I also like affirming. It says, I'm affirming who you are, and I'm acknowledging that. I'm going to make an active effort to affirm you. And then belonging, I think, is great. And that's, Blaine, did you come up with belonging?
No, actually, Stephanie did. Stephanie Smith is an amazing woman who we've contracted with over the last year to lead our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts here at Save Inc. All of our staff and board go through it and are involved in it. And I was just going to say, I love the word belonging. I think that, you can say we want to include you in this, but how do we make you feel like you belong? Is I think takes it another step.
Right.
All of our DEIB efforts started in race-based training, and they've moved beyond that to say, how do we make sure that everybody, whether they're a staff member, a board member, a client, a resident, how do we make sure that they feel like they belong here at Save Inc.?
Well, I would love between now and next time, I think we can continue to brainstorm some ideas about how we can support one another. And then next time, maybe I can talk more about what that might look like.
And hopefully, we always try. We can't always confirm, but if we can, we'll get one or two of the kids to I shouldn't say kids, youth, young people, to speak to you about how they feel about their experiences.
And Blaine, if they can't come in person, I know that you mentioned that a couple of the youth have made videos, both for KCPT and maybe another organization. Would that, I know it wouldn't be the same as in person, but if they're not comfortable or if it doesn't work out, would that be something that?
Actually, we'll work on that. I was going to use one of them tonight. Oh. And using video in Zoom is really, really hard. Okay. So I'll keep working on that. You have to have a very specific file type to do it. And neither of these are that file type, but I'll keep working on it
Well, I just wanted,
because they're both very powerful videos.